right, good afternoon, everybody. First of all, just thanks for coming to this forum. I think it's going to be the best forum in the building. This is actually the first time that they're hosting a panel like this, where it's patient advocacy organizations really kind of talking about what's going on in that world, which I think is quite special. My quick background is I am a blood cancer survivor, and I'm currently a board member at Blood Cancer United, which is the largest blood cancer research and advocacy organization in the country. And I got to tell you, when I was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma many years ago, 25 years ago now, I had no idea about these types of organizations until I received my clearance. I was all cured and everything, and somebody came up to me and was like, you should meet with, it used to be called Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. I was in New York City at the time, and I was introduced to the executive director there in the city, and I've been attached to them for the last 20 plus years. And this is what this forum's all about. These patient advocacy organizations, if you don't know, are really the groups that kind of stitch things together, ecosystems for rare diseases, for common diseases, and they are doing yeoman's work, from research, funding it, patient advocacy work, working with patients to help them through their disease diagnosis, promotion, really, of raising awareness, all kinds of things. So it's a really, really, really important topic to bring up today. So why this panel? Here's the problem that exists, I think. There's a category of diseases that falls into one or two traps. It's either too rare, and we have a couple rare diseases here on this panel, to attract attention of large commercial players, or it's so hard to treat, it's very challenging, that the risk-reward math often doesn't work out for traditional investors or big pharma. So in both cases, patients are waiting sometimes for decades, with no one at the table fighting for the science that could help them. And this is where we step in. Patient advocacy organizations, we show up for those diseases. All of these organizations represent that. They convene the scientists, like I said, the early stage research that nobody else will push because it's too risky, and they close the gap at the end of the day. That's what it's really, really all about. And we have so many great examples that we'll talk about today. So I'm going to quickly kind of cap the panel here, who's on it. We're not with names yet. We're going to transition to that pretty soon. The 5 people across this panel represent 5 different types of models. So advocacy it's a very dynamic industry. One's the Family Foundation that co-developed an FDA-approved drug. We have a venture philanthropy fund that invests in Alzheimer's research, like a venture capital fund. We have a legal advocate who takes rare diseases and patients to Capitol Hill, and a surgeon and researcher who left academic medicine to embed patients directly into a $158 million federal research program, and a research director whose organization placed a bet on a scientist in 1988 that became the first drug to delay type 1 diabetes 34 years later. So the pressure and sometimes it takes a long time to get these drugs into the market, and that's why you need advocacy organizations. So we're constantly putting the pressure on. So I'm going to introduce the panel. Or they're going to introduce themselves, and it's not going to be bios, right? I think when I first went to Capitol Hill with Blood Cancer United, this is the first thing they told all of us as we're heading into the room with the legislators, was to know your why. And I think that's the question I want to ask each of you guys. And I'll start with you, Aria. Why?
Hi, everyone. My name's Aria. I'm currently a PhD student at Weill Cornell Medicine. I have an MPH and BA from Yale, and I also work at NYU Langone doing population health research. But I think I'm here today more because I was born with spinal muscular atrophy in 2000, and at the time, SMA, despite it being an incredibly rare disease, was the #1 genetic killer in infants. And today, in 2026, it's considered a chronic disease that's managed by 3 safe and effective treatments. I was really lucky to grow up watching that transition happen in real time. My parents, my dad's an alumni, he's here. taking photos in the back. But my parents, who had backgrounds in finance and education, completely pivoted their lives to found the foundation, which was, unlike most nonprofits, exclusively dedicated to drug development. And so starting from literally nothing, they helped build the infrastructure needed to move SMA research forward and ultimately invested $150 million to help spearhead the development of the 3 drugs that now exist, the first of which was the fastest FDA approval for a drug to receive. But at the same time, kind of going back to your why, I grew up as a patient inside that system, and so I spent 25 years in clinical research for those drugs. I grew up thinking Columbia University Medical Center was literally my second home, and I've used a wheelchair since I was 6 years old, being pretty much the only person in a wheelchair in every academic, professional, and social setting I was in, including at Yale. And so ironically, for a really long time, I wanted nothing to do with medicine or disability because I felt like it hit too close to home, but that really changed here at Yale, where I was kind of adamant at first that I didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. But over time, my experiences as a patient, both the good and the bad, started to really reshape how I thought about advocacy and medicine. And those experiences really motivated me to want to improve quality of life for people with disabilities, especially children, whether that's humanizing medicine and emphasizing patient-centered care or advocating for support systems that let people thrive, and really just helping to normalize disability. And so I think at some point in my own journey, I started to feel kind of a moral obligation to use my experiences instead of hiding from them to help other people. And so I think kind of putting that all together for me and my family, building that infrastructure for Cure both really meant the drug development side to literally create curative treatments, but also the advocacy side to maximize patients' quality of life.
Thank you. That's amazing. I'll give it to you.
Thank you. My name is Bridget Brennan. I'm with the Friedreich's Ataxia Research Alliance, or FARA. I've been there about 11 and a half years when my oldest son was diagnosed with Friedreich's ataxia, which is a degenerative neurological condition, presents in children usually in children between 5 and 15, results in loss of mobility within 10 to 15 years and loss of life in mid-30s. When he was diagnosed, there was nothing to slow or stop the progression of that condition. So why is very obvious as to why I got in there, but a lot of learning curve. I was actually a prosecutor in the Bronx before I had children. I knew nothing about drug development. I now sit on the board. I'm general counsel, and I head up advocacy for FARA. So 11 years, you'll learn a lot. But I think the biggest reason why I'm here today to speak to you at this Innovation Summit is that if you're working in a disease space, the group that knows that disease the best is the patient advocacy group. They're the ones that have contact with all of the researchers, all of the sponsors, all of the patients. They usually set up assets that everybody needs and wants, like natural history studies or cell lines. They know which families are willing to invest in products, so they help with funding opportunities. They're in DC, they're working with other groups to pass legislation and work on appropriations. So they actually have the pulse of everything that's affecting their condition the most. So this morning, if you happen to have been in the session on trends in life science investment, one of the things they talked about is if you want to get funding, you need to know the relationships. You have to build trust with who's going to support you, or you have to bring someone that already has that trust. So I'm here to tell you that patient advocacy groups have built that trust with every stakeholder in their sphere. And if you want to get into that group, bring us along. We're going to help you all the way. So, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about the specifics, but we'll get to that later.
Is it on? Yes. I'm Karen Harris from the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation. I have a bit of a different story, which is that I was an investment banker for 20 years, and at a certain point, I'd had enough, and I just decided I really wanted to do mission-based work. I was the CFO of 2 social services organizations when I was recruited to the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation. And ADDF was founded by Leonard and Ronald Lauder in honor of their mother, Estee Lauder, who had Alzheimer's disease. And it was founded as a venture philanthropy, which means that rather than give grants to researchers, we invest in biotechs and structure royalty agreements with academia, all for the mission of accelerating the treatment, the drug discovery and development for Alzheimer's disease. And it's just been a really interesting time to be in the Alzheimer's field. There have been 2 drugs approved by the FDA since I've been there, and 2 blood-based biomarkers approved by the FDA. And it's just been really an exciting time, and I'm very hopeful for the future of getting better treatments and new treatments for Alzheimer's.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kimberly Steele, and as Josh said, I'm a surgeon. I was a surgeon at Johns Hopkins for over 14 years. I was an associate professor. And why am I here as a patient advocate? Because I thought I was a patient advocate for my patients. I won a humanitarian award as a surgical resident at Penn State, and patients were everything for me. But it became really personal for me when my child, at the age of 5, was diagnosed after a year-long diagnostic odyssey with an ultra-rare, life-threatening disease that affects his lymphatic system. It wasn't inherited, somatic, and it actually was caused by very similar mutations that are caused by cancer. Yet, there was no funding. There is no home at the NIH for the lymphatic system. And so I stepped away from my job because we were told he had 5 years at best with a 35% chance, partial treatments, all toxic chemotherapies, and no cure. So I tried my own nonprofit. That went okay. We did get a fellow into a lab, and we were able to find a mouse model, and we got a clinical biomarker. But it moves so slow, and it's incremental, and we don't have time. And so I heard about ARPA-H, and that's the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health. They were looking for really tough, hard problems. And I pitched that the lymphatic system is a really tough problem. And I'm here today to share with you how, as a program manager, I have definitely invested in patient advocates in a big way, because I recognize, having now navigated the crazy healthcare system to find treatments and save my child, that we need the patient's voice.
Excellent. And my name is Josh Veith. I'm with Breakthrough T1D. We rebranded about 2 years ago, so you may know us from our previous name of the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, or JDRF, the walks and rides with all the blue colors. I had a little bit of a different path to my role. I was working in academic research, primarily immune oncology. I'm an immunologist by training. And admittedly, I was getting a little burnout with the grind of grant writing and the academic lifestyle. I'm sure some people here could probably commiserate with that. So I started looking at other opportunities, and I had somebody reach out about a position at then JDRF, now Breakthrough 2D. And they kind of posed the question, would you be interested in working for a nonprofit? And thinking about everything from career advancement to salary, whatever it is, I thought, I don't know if I want to go from academia to a nonprofit. But I met with the team, and it became very apparent when I met with the scientists and the leadership that this was an organization that drives real change by combining research funding with legislative advocacy, with medical affairs, and then a very strong industry and pharma-focused network. I didn't come in with a personal connection. And I felt like a little bit of an imposter when I would go to events representing Breakthrough T1D, and people would say, oh, well, what's your personal connection to type 1 diabetes, right? But the thing that happened is, shortly after I took this position, I found out just how many people in my life are affected by type 1 diabetes. Friends, children of close friends from college, family members, coworkers from previous positions, all living and managing type 1 diabetes, and now understanding what that means and what that life is like and the extra decisions and stress that causes. I can definitely say I have a very strong personal connection. And just getting to meet the community around our organization, our donors, our supporters, the people that attend our events and support our research, I guess you could say I've sort of become a convert, knowing the power of advancing strong science, but knowing that the science you're advancing is leading to real world change for people that are living with these diseases and disorders is a really rewarding and it's a really powerful position to be in.
Thank you. That's one of our goals here, is to convert all of you guys into advocates for your chosen disease, because it is a really gratifying, I think, career volunteer opportunity. But before we really begin to roll through our questions, this is a great suggestion from one of the panelists. We just wanted to get a little temperature for who's in this room. You can raise your hands. Do we have researchers in this room? Do you want to raise your hand? All right. Do we have investors in this room? Excellent. What other kind of people? Sponsors? Founders, of course. Okay. I think we have questions that will satisfy everybody here. And it's going to be arranged. So we're going to talk about patient advocacy.
Shouldn't you be asking if there's patients or advocates?
That's true. Yeah, there are patients and advocates here. Great. So I look forward to all your questions. So we're going to talk about advocacy, the traditional advocacy. We're going to talk about funding models. So we're going to have a range of things, legislative affairs, and then we'll end with some Q&A. So the first thing I want to ask, and I want to kind of direct this at first, and everybody obviously can chime in on this one, is for Kimberly and Aria. Because you both are, rare diseases. You started a small startup advocacy firm, but then you jumped into another type of format, and it takes a lot of work even in that format. And same with you, your family. You were diagnosed, and they really kind of rushed to put a foundation around this where none existed, right? So I want you guys to just talk about the dynamics of what it takes to stand up these types of organizations. If you want to go first, or let's go with Aria.
Yeah, I think for SMA, it's an interesting rare disease because the gene was founded in 1995, and so it was lucky in that sense. And so when I was born in 2000, there actually was a lot of interest from the scientific community, but like you kind of mentioned in your intro, it just wasn't rational for a pharma company to invest so much money and time into R&D when their drug would affect at best 10,000 patients. And so my family essentially took away that risk as a form of advocacy, and started that by going and getting 50 of the top scientists at the time to sign off on a letter kind of validating the SMA story was one of actual hope instead of a waste of time. And through that was able to kind of get buy-in from the NIH. DOD ended up being one of their biggest funders. And then also real political advocates like Nancy Pelosi and Rahm Emanuel. And so I think that kind of ability to communicate more broadly that we can take away the risk and ensure that this actually has scientific promise was really what kind of helped shape that and get people interested that were but didn't have a financial reason to be. And then I think on the other hand, kind of de-risking the science. And so, like I think a lot of panelists have talked about here, patients couldn't afford to wait for a placebo trial or for the typical timeline for an FDA drug approval. And so they essentially funded a natural history study to act as a placebo trial, so that, making the case that a placebo trial would kill patients. SMA was fatal. So they did that simultaneously, and that was kind of what enabled the FDA to grant the first SMA drug with its fastest approval. But I think kind of de-risking the science and de-risking the buy-in from the scientific and the financial and also the patient side was really important for SMA.
Okay. It was really, really tough. So this rare disease maybe was 30 patients at the most. And I knew I had the background in science, but man, doing a nonprofit, I tried, right? I knew there was such urgency. And I went with the smaller nonprofit that was based on this ultra-rare disease, and I worked with them, and I helped write grants, and that was great, but everything was still so incremental. I went to the NIH. I was able to talk with Francis Collins, like, why are our grants not being funded? because our basic researchers, we were being told it's too rare. And what did I need to do? Okay, as a mom, I'm going to do everything. As my child was in the hospital very, very sick, and I recognized how lucky I was that I had the ability to advocate for him, to speak up where many parents, they have to trust. I promised, and I'm not religious, but I promised I was going to do everything in my power to make sure that this disease and others like it are not forgotten. And so I tried the nonprofit, and then we did get some incremental steps, as I told you. But what I saw was that my child, as an N of one, was bringing all the silos together. All the disparate people that would not otherwise work together came together. And he's now 17. He's at Capitol Hill right now advocating. So we are so grateful for that. So then I moved on to another nonprofit and worked with them, which was a bigger one, and felt like, okay, we'll ride on the coattails of another nonprofit. But again, everything was so incremental because lymphatics has no market. So for the VCs out here, there is going to be a market. I'm telling you, as a surgeon, as a scientist, man, have we dismissed such an important critical system. So when I had this opportunity to go pitch, it took me almost 2 years to get that pitch down. But man, I went and I pitched in front of a lot of smart people the importance of the lymphatic system, and they heard. And so now, as I said, we have these two programs. It's $300 million close to, that is going to be invested in early diagnostics and as well therapeutics. And it's not just for rare disease, though. ARPA-H is very agnostic. So the way that I did this and approached it was to go agnostic. Let's use the lymphatic system. We have to see it first to treat it, but the lymphatic system has so many underlying associations with other chronic diseases. Let's target the lymphatic system. Let's get drugs into it and bypass liver metabolism and off-target side effects. And so that's been my approach.
It's amazing. For the room, I don't know how many people know what ARPA-H is, where it sits inside of the government structure.
So ARPA-H, if anyone knows DARPA, the defense agency, DARPA was built to defend our country and do it quickly because Eisenhower did not like the Sputnik surprise. And DARPA is responsible for self-driving cars. We just got to drive in one. My mom's here with me too, and we got to drive in one. So they're responsible for that. They're responsible for the MR vaccine and the internet. So almost 4 years ago, this ARPA-H, which is government agency, was started up as a brand new startup to do just what DARPA does, but with health. And the model is very different than the traditional grants where people get funding, things are incremental, there's well-established questions inside these well-disciplined medical systems, right? But what is different is here, ARPA takes big bets on high-risk, high-reward topics, technologies. It's at the place where the VCs aren't ready yet, but are engaged and want to see something. It's at the part where someone comes in with this really great idea, but doesn't have a good proof of concept yet, and just needs that proof of concept. And we're willing to de-risk it so that the next funder. And then the other thing that's really great about ARPA-H is they find these program managers with these good ideas, and the program managers come and pitch it, and then they run the programs. And these programs can be comprehensive. It's not just on one topic. So if you have a great idea, come find me. They are looking for program managers as well. I said, I don't want to go anywhere yet. These are term limited, so you'll only get 3 years, and then you get another 3 years if you're really great. So I'm working on being really great.
That's great. Bridget, from your perspective, a rare disease also, how did the organization how did it come to be? Like, how did you guys build that?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. So we were founded by a gentleman whose child was diagnosed with FA back in 1998. He was working on Capitol Hill, and he realized that when he went out to look at some of the umbrella groups that were out there, NORD or MDA, which we fall under, or even NAFT, which is the National Ataxia Foundation, they were providing support services, but not research. And he really wanted a organization that only focused on research. And so that is our mission statement. We don't do camps or support groups. We only work on research. And having that very narrow mission statement has really driven us to expand in ways that other organizations can't. For example, we have grown from a national organization to international. We have over 30 clinical sites around the country that work directly with us. So if there's an industry partner that wants to run a clinical trial, well, we have sites available. When we had the whole issue of insecurities or uncertainties here in the US, we're like, no problem. We have sites in Europe. We have sites in Australia. Let's talk about moving your program somewhere else. In all of those sites, we have developed relationships with the communities, and we educate our community so that they understand what's coming down the pipeline. It doesn't always happen like this, because when my son was diagnosed, there wasn't very much, and our pipeline is quite robust now. But the first clinical trial that my son enrolled in closed in 20 minutes. Because our community was well aware that that trial was coming. We were all sitting waiting for that email to come that it was open. And so they understand what's ahead of them. We hold patient engagement symposiums regularly where we invite researchers to come in. We also create opportunities, and I'm sure other people can speak about silos, that there's a lot of silos that happen. And one of the greatest things our founder did was he went out and he reached out to everybody working in the FA space, all these researchers around the world, and none of them had met each other. And he's like, we need a conference and bring all these people together. They need to talk to each other. And so we've continued to do that, and we have grown for just a small, I think it was 200 people that showed up, including patients, the first time. We're holding our next one in Atlanta, and it will be thousands of people, and it will sell out, and it'll be researchers from around the world. So you bring people in together, give them opportunities to sort of talk. It's always that glass of wine or coffee after a symposium that someone thinks of a great idea. So all those things build on opportunities for stakeholders to advance their programs.
I want to touch that point in terms of the convening nature of advocacy organizations. I think that is one of the biggest things that we do, is bringing ecosystems together. But I want to kind of focus in on you guys, Josh and Karen. Rare diseases, and then you guys have not necessarily rare diseases, more, I wouldn't call them mainstream diseases, but bigger diseases, bigger patient populations. Where inside of your organizations is advocacy really important? I think people just assume you're going to get funding because it's Alzheimer's. You're going to get funding for T1D. Where in your organizations is it really essential for advocacy?
Well, let me start with
Yeah.
It's actually really difficult to get funding for Alzheimer's disease. Pharma, fortunately, has come back into Alzheimer's disease with these recent approvals by the FDA, and the blood-based biomarkers are going to really change things. But Alzheimer's, it's not easy to get money, and ADDF views itself as a convener of biotechs and pharma and government venture capital to actually get more money into Alzheimer's disease. And we take that role very seriously. When we invest in companies, we help them to find follow-on funding. And, we're spending time meeting with venture capitalists to try to get more investment. And with these blood-based biomarkers, I think we're de-risking the investment into Alzheimer's, because you can make sure that the patients in your trial are the right patients. The trials are more efficient, they're cheaper, we have early diagnosis. And I'm hoping that with these blood-based biomarkers that we'll de-risk the investment into Alzheimer's, and that venture capitalists will start to come in. And ADDF invests at the IND enabling to the phase 2A stage, which is a very hard area because VCs now really want proof of concept. So we're trying to come in and get the companies to an inflection point where VCs and pharma can invest.
Thank you.
This is probably a not very articulate way to say it, but I'd like to think that type 1 diabetes has a little bit of a middle-class problem, that we're not rare enough to get rare disease designation and to be able to take advantage of those pathways through the FDA. But it's not a large enough group of individuals to really garner strong pharma interest as something that's economically feasible to run through, let's say, a phase 3 study. So a big part of what we do as well is de-risking. And, to the founders in the audience, success really, know who your ideal patient population is within that disease, and then know who's responding to your therapy. That's how we are able to de-risk and move things and bring in the major pharma partners that can actually fund the phase 3 trials. In terms of the ways we advocate, we started similarly to other organizations. Two moms, Carol Lurie and Lee Ducat in New York and Philly back in the 70s, started this organization because they saw that problem. Because of the foundation they set, and today we have $400 million in active research and industry investments. We put another 50 to 100 million into that each year, and this is all donor-derived funds. So we've been able to build a large network and connect people around the world that are living with or caring for somebody or know somebody with type 1 diabetes to really take that collective power and put it into something that's actionable. I think the biomarker question is absolutely critical for moving forward. Being a patient advocacy organization allows you to be a neutral party. So when products are coming through development from early biotech stage into pharma, or there's barriers identified in sort of the regulatory guidance or the pathway for a drug to develop, we can go to the FDA. We can bring our patients and families with us, and we can sit down and say, this is the real risk versus benefit ratio that we're having to deal with. This is what living with this disease is actually like on a day-to-day basis. And we're able to push a little stronger with both Congress and the European legislatures as well as the regulatory organizations around the world to drive change more so than, let's say, a for-profit entity could.
Yeah. It leads to the next point, which I think is very interesting, and I think a lot of these groups up here are doing this, but the patient voice comes in so many different ways right now, and I want to talk about it in two ways. One is down in Washington. A lot of your organizations are bringing advocates down there to the FDA or to their congressmen and senators. That's one mechanism we're using. And the other one I think is really interesting. I know we're doing it at Blood Cancer United with clinical trials. Most of when we give a grant or some funding, you have to include the patient perspective in the design of the clinical trial, or else you won't get the funding. And I think I'm surprised it hasn't happened earlier. I'm sure it's been happening for a longer time than I know. But let's talk about that. So what's going on in the patient voice? We can talk about it from a legislative voice, and I'd also like to talk about, I know, the patient duo program, which is really, really interesting at ARPA. And I know you guys do that as well. So who wants to start off on the patient voice? It's a broad question.
It is a broad question. I mean, I have a recent example that came up. We have a participant advisory council. So when we fund clinical trials, we ask that investigators go to our PAC, run the materials and the trial design through individuals living with type 1 diabetes, their caregivers, sometimes even children if it's a pediatric trial, so they can sort of be told what the trial is and whether or not they want to take part in it. And we recently had an oral therapy with an extremely strong safety profile that an investigator was pushing to a phase 2 study. And we put it through our PAC, and we used our pediatric PAC members because it was a ped study. And it came back that the majority of the kids in the PAC said that they would not participate in the study. And we were kind of dumbfounded. We thought, is it too scary? Was it not explained well? Are there too many doctor visits? What's going on? So we ended up going back to the PAC members that took part, and we said, hey, this study, why don't you want to participate? And one of the ways you gauge whether or not a therapy in type 1 diabetes is working is by using a mixed meals tolerance test, right? So individuals are given a protein shake with a known quantity of carbohydrates, they drink it, and then we measure insulin production to see how well their beta cells are working. Well, in this documentation, the investigator put in that they'd be given sort of like an Ensure-like shake, and in parentheses said strawberry flavored, and then went on. And the feedback was actually that the kids really, the strawberry flavored sounded gross. And we went back, we took the flavor out entirely, and the majority of participants then said they would take part in the study. So it's kind of like a funny example, but it really highlights how important it is to bring in the individuals that you're targeting, the population you're targeting early in the process, because that's going to help incredibly, not only with trial design, but in how you communicate the trial to potential participants and how you develop the materials.
Yeah, I mean, I guess going off of that a little bit, I think, just patients don't experience trials as protocols. They experience them as really meaningful changes to their life. And they're also, I think like a lot of people here have said, the best experts in their disease and how to live with it and how to manage it, all of which is really important for a clinical trial. And so I think there becomes a really odd duality of something that becomes part of your life for so many years on a regular basis, but also it never feels normal and it always feels disruptive and remarkable. And so I think, kind of going off of your example, I can give you two. I think one, I spent 25 years in clinical research, and I was the first person in the entire world to receive one of the SMA drugs, and I was the third for another of the drugs. And I'm so lucky and grateful for that, but it was also really exhausting as a child. I missed a third of every school year to be in the hospital for the clinical trial appointments. I couldn't read consent forms when I was given them as a kid. And I felt isolated from most kids my age. And I think, for the first drug that was developed, it actually required trips to the operating room every 8 weeks because the drug was delivered under general anesthesia through the spinal cord. And so one of those dosings was on my 10th birthday, and I was crying because I didn't want to be there. And my mom very warmly said, "This is the best gift you're ever going to get in your life." And I remember, and I think that to this day, I tell this story because I think it summarizes kind of a lot of that conflicting duality that all trial participants go through, whether you're 12 or 30. And I think, on one hand, even as a 12-year-old, I understood how lucky and how grateful I was to be there, but also having to balance that with the physical discomfort and the emotional pain. And the exhaustion can be challenging, but also really important information. And so I think on a more micro scale about kind of how, a patient voice changed a really well-intentioned but maybe misinformed trial was for the third drug that was developed. It required these really extensive, multiple-hour-long eye exams because in the monkey studies at very, very high doses that really wouldn't be relevant to patients, there was some loss of peripheral vision. And, I think that was obviously incredibly well-intentioned. That took time and money and effort to implement for a reason. But at the same time, I was a junior in high school, and that was genuinely the most disruptive part of any trial that I ever took part in because I was spending days a month at the hospital to get things poked into my eye, and my eyes were dilated for a day after, and so I couldn't do homework, and I was trying to get into Yale. And so, I made the point to the researchers that, I think meeting people where they are, I understood that was only coming from a good place and that was there to protect patients. But at the same time, I actually thought it was hurting patients and maybe doing more harm than good. And, they listened, they changed the protocol, that they reduced the amount of time and frequency that they do those tests. And it turned out okay. And I'm on that drug now. And I think that was a really good example that I give a lot of credit to the research team on, of really thoughtful collaboration and kind of this willingness to listen and meet each other on both ends. And so I think that, they wouldn't have ever done that if they hadn't known what patients experienced because they're not the patient. And I think being able to kind of trust and listen to that patient feedback and knowing that it's coming from a reason is important.
Maybe I can give an example of where a patient voice is the only voice that might handle a situation at both Capitol Hill and with the agencies. So there has been a lot of turbulence, we'll say, going on right now at many of the agencies. And one of the fallouts from that has been advisory councils that approve grants. People are coming up to their term limits and there hasn't been renewals or there hasn't been new people appointed. And some of these advisory councils are getting to the point where they're not going to have a quorum so that they can't then give a grant out. So individual researchers may not know who to turn to for that, and what they do is they turn to our organization and they turn to other patient organizations to do something about it. But then in addition to that, there's this new layer that the president has put on where there's a political appointee on top of the peer-reviewed that has to sign off on a grant. Many of those spots haven't been filled. So even if you can get a council to approve a grant, there is actually no political appointee above them to actually okay the grant to actually get the money to the researchers. Individually, those researchers really aren't going to go to Capitol Hill to talk about their specific grant, but they're going to start complaining to the patient advocacy groups like, are you guys hearing about this? What's going on? And now as a group of agencies, of different organizations that come together, we can go to Capitol Hill and say, hey, your action is causing this kind of result and slowing our research down. And so it's a really good feedback that they're not going to get from anyone else because we're getting that sort of overview. Similarly, sometimes Capitol Hill makes decisions and then the agencies try to implement those decisions, but then they don't always get that right either. And so, for example, there's a program called the Pediatric Priority Review Voucher Program, which gives incentives to companies to develop pediatric drugs. It's great. It's a wonderful program. I love it. I fought hard for it. But when the original regulations were written, they said that 50% of the population had to be pediatrics. Well, in our condition, almost all of them are diagnosed in pediatrics, but we keep them alive too long. So our population is now bigger. So that little clause would have caused us a lot of grief, and we were the ones that caught it and went back to the FDA and said, do you know this is the way you wrote that? And they're like, oh, no, that's not what we meant. So, patient advocacy groups are also looking out for those kind of little blurbs that might affect your group that no one else is going to catch.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think there's a lot of sausage making that people don't realize down in Washington after a bill's passed, and then somebody's actually writing the actual language to implement it.
Exactly.
It happens in so many places. I'd like to hear about the Discovery Duo.
Okay. So we just heard how powerful patients' voices are. And as a program manager, I'm mandated to ensure that the technology that we create makes it to those who was intended for. And that's the neat thing about ARPA-H is that they have a lot of foundational infrastructure for us. We have the Office of Commercialization. I have Marie Wax with us today, who supports to ensure that technology gets to those that need it. However, we know that that's tough without the patient's voice. Why? Because of the stories we just heard. Aria's told it so beautifully. My son, what he went through. And I saw it from both sides. I saw it from the patient side, the parent, but also from the physician, trying to do everything we can for a patient. The researchers who never hear the patient's voices. The bench researchers. My son came and gave a talk at 9 years old to a group of researchers, all basic scientists, and the flood of scientists that came over to us to thank us because they heard the story for why they're doing what they're doing. So when I was asked to ensure that our technology makes it to those who need it, I knew two things. One, we needed the patients. We also needed the early investigators, those outside of the field, those that maybe would be really interested in lymphatics if they were actually, showcased and see what the lymphatics are all about. So each of my teams it's mandated, must pick and form a team of a patient or caregiver ambassador. Someone who's not, always talking, someone who's out in the rural America, someone who's not on Facebook all the time, right? Because it's the same patients that are trying to advocate, but those that we need to hear a voice from. And then they're matched with an early scientific investigator, someone outside the lymphatic field. And where did that come from? My own experience as a mom fighting for my child. I had the background, but I knew we were an N of one. We had to study it. I called a basic researcher up in his lab and said, please help me study this. And I attended his lab meetings every Friday. And I saw how we can change the science, just like these things, the small things, the clinical consents, the having to go and get blood tests a zillion times, or taking a kid out of school to get to where they needed to go. So that changed my whole outlook, and we called ourselves the dynamic duo. So now at our age, I have the discovery duos. We have 20 of them, pairs, and they are part of the team. They have a voice. They sit at the table from day one. They meet at all of the scientific meetings. They will be part of whatever regulatory process. They learned IRB process, so they understand what the researchers are doing. Now it is time on their side, right? They are volunteering their time, but they are loving it. And we now have the early investigators. I have interventional radiologists. I have pathologists. I have rheumatoid arthritis docs. I have cardiologists, medical students, undergrads that are postdocs that are like excited about lymphatics. And when they hear the patient stories, they go, wow, I've learned more in this hour than in the last 3 years of my postdoc work. So that's what we're doing. All of my teams do voice sessions where they're going out with stakeholders specific to their technology to find the gaps, the challenges, and the opportunities. And they're going to work to build the market that is unclaimed right now. So
That's great. Thank you for all sharing that. The patient voice, obviously, so important. We only have 15 minutes left, so I want to get to the numbers because we're at a business school. So we all have different funding models to provide funding for research and grant making. And we also do very interesting things. So I want to kind of focus on Karen here because the way your organization was set up was just as a VC-funded type of investment vehicle, right? Let's talk about that.
I'll talk about that.
Yeah.
So we invest in biotechs just like a venture capitalist would invest. We invest through preferred stock, and we're in VC rounds with other venture capitalists. The difference is that as a foundation, we're able to take more risk than the venture capitalists can. So we're able to invest either earlier or in more risky targets than the VCs are. And we also have royalty structures with academia. So we work with them closely as well, and we've helped them to spin out companies. And the venture philanthropy model is something where we're able to act quickly, and really we're just able to accelerate the science. And we've really focused on novel targets because pharma was investing in amyloid and tau. And so we decided to invest in the underlying biology and inflammation and metabolism and vascular health. And I think that those areas were really quite risky. And so we've really brought new science, and now 70% of the clinical trials being done in Alzheimer's are non-amyloid and tau, which is where pharma focus. So we've really been able to expand the field because we're able to take more risks.
How common is this venture model within these types of nonprofits that focus on diseases?
You see it in a handful of foundations or companies like the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. There's a Multiple Myeloma Foundation. There's several others, and each does their own thing a bit differently. Mm-hmm. But you do see them from time to time.
You guys do that too, right, at T1D?
We do. Compared to the history of our organization, we're relatively new to the VC game.
Yeah.
About 6 or 7 years ago now, we spun out sort of an affiliate daughter organization called the T1D Fund. So while we still, through the foundation, give academic grants, and we actually support companies through grant-style mechanisms, particularly very early-stage companies that aren't quite investable yet, our T1D Fund invests as a typical VC firm according to our mission. And I think there's real power in sort of bringing VC into the mission-driven aspect. Mm-hmm. It can really advance things, and particularly from my experience, having that associated with a foundation is really important. So if the T1D fund invests in a company that's related to, let's say, the portfolio that I oversee on the foundation side, I will sit in on project update committee meetings with that company. And multiple times now I've been sitting in that meeting and the company is discussing a barrier or a problem they're facing in their development that we've invested in through the fund. And in my head, I think, wow, we're funding, Dr. Smith at Yale on this exact problem. So then the real power of being a sort of convener, a foundation comes into play, and we can start connecting people, right? We can pull the connection with that biotech company we're invested in, put them together with the right academic, and actually move both paths forward. And then you bring in sort of the pharma-facing aspect. We meet with the major pharma partners on a regular basis. We're under CDA. We know what's in their pipeline. And so that also lets us position our VC investments according to gaps in the field and what we know we can move the entire sort of infrastructure forward.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We do that also at Blood Cancer United. They have it's been around for 10 years. It used to be just on the balance sheet, they would kind of donate $2 million. And now they've structured it as a separate fund, which is, it's great. So they're going to be able to invest in probably a wider swath of early stage drugs. We have about 9 minutes left, and I feel like we have so much more to talk about. But I wanted to give the room some opportunity to ask some questions if you'd like. Okay, let's go.
Hi, my name is Nupur Garg. I'm the founder of ProPatient Tech, and we try to enable lifestyle care in every clinical setting. I just want to say thank you guys. This was one of the best panels I have been to, like Joshua said. Tears came to my eyes when Aria was talking, and it's still actually, I'm a little bit. I actually think there's a few things that I wanted to hear a little bit more about. One of them is curing and treating the actual medical illness. I love science. There's this new therapy that I just heard about where they modify the PCSK9 gene permanently, and that will help people have lower cholesterol and not have to be on drugs. Started by this company, Verve, whose mission is to eliminate MI. And I don't know if any of that is something, the genetic type of modifications is something that all of you all are looking at instead of just biologics. That's one question. The second question that is treating, there's the second question of just managing with the disease, whether it's managing during treatment or quality of life because of the disease. And I don't feel like I heard too much about that, but I know that these groups are so important with that. As a physician, I often am referring people to the advocacy sites that you all maintain to see what kind of resources are available. And I think those are very good resources sometimes. So I'm wondering about how all of that comes together, patient involvement in those, patient advocacy, but also if there is something that you wish was better in that realm.
Let's take that one.
Yeah, I guess to answer both of your questions, on the SMA side, Zolgensma was the most recently FDA-approved drug, and it got a lot of buzz because it's the most expensive. It was at the time the most expensive drug in the world at $2.6 million. But it was a one-time treatment, and the argument was that it was curative. And in a lot of this, or in all of the studies, 100% of the children given the drug, even in SMA's most aggressive form under the age of 2, were asymptomatic. And that's true of the other drugs too, but a little less explicitly in those drugs you're on for life. And so that was kind of like I think in a lot of scientific communities, what started the buzz around gene therapy, and that was back in 2020, so around COVID. And then I think on the other side, in my experience, I was really lucky to be in all those clinical trials, but it still was 15 or so years before the first SMA drug was approved, and even 10 years before I was on the first trial. And so in that time, SMA is, it causes irreversible motor neuron damage. And so in that time I was declining. And so it was only about disease management and care until those drugs came around. And my parents were maniacs about doing 3 hours of physical therapy every single day. I had to have 24/7 nursing care. I had multiple wheelchairs because if one broke, I still needed a way to get to school. And I think I guess a couple of things on that note. I think one, my parents were incredibly supportive, intelligent, capable people, but I still needed professional hospital-grade medical care at home, and a lot of people do, especially, I had a more mild form of the disease, but especially in the more advanced stages. But I think also, the idea of backup, I think, is a really big one in terms of disease management for families, in terms of supporting, your child or your patient, both in terms of technology like wheelchairs, but also in terms of physical care. And so I think, from the physical therapy side, that was also the biggest thing that we pushed for, and that was even seen in the natural history studies, because until those drugs really came around, having that 360 care, I was in the pool every day, I was on getting land physical therapy every day, and that all wasn't necessarily intuitive when I was diagnosed, and it all ended up probably being what let those drugs work. And so I think kind of thinking outside the box, and also you learn as you go, but yeah.
So we have a treatment now. It slows neurological loss, but doesn't address some of the underlying conditions around the cardiac piece, which is what our children die from. But that said, we have 5 active clinical trials right now. We have 7 studies going on. We're expecting a few drugs to probably be submitted this year. So there's real progress and movement. I'd like to mention the second part of your question about the managing the clinical trials versus living life, particularly when you're dealing with a progressive condition. We now know, particularly from the SMA work that's been done, to give medication to children earlier, or to anybody in their disease earlier, is better, right? We know if you give it to them earlier, we slow the progression, or we might be able to stop the progression. But when you start talking about children, there's a lot of whole ethics issues around getting children into clinical trials, which our organization has been fighting very hard against, because we're like, we know what tomorrow brings. It brings death. So clinical trial isn't as scary to us. Can we please try to get our children in sooner? But at the same token, as a parent, your child is most mobile, most healthy the day you get your diagnosis. Every day forward, they lose something. So you then ask them to stop going to school, stop participating in their sports, stop playing with their friends, to do these clinical trials when they're not showing the symptoms, or they're showing mild symptoms. So it's a balance for families to do the clinical trials and to take a life that you've heard that incorporates hospitals and doctors as part of your growing up, to get to that end. So I feel very indebted. My son participated, but he wasn't alone. There was a lot of children with him, and so I'm very indebted to all those families that took the time to do that.
If no one else can jump in, I can say that, we divide our strategy into both curative research and improving lives. And that funding breakdown changes, right? 12 years ago, most of our funding went to improving lives because we started the artificial pancreas project, and that led to the technology behind that started Dexcom and Medtronic and all the artificial pancreas systems. Now about 70% of our research goes to curative therapies because of where the field is, right? And building on something Bridget said, this is, I think, an extremely important point. If maybe a good takeaway is knowing your population, but knowing the populations within your population. The staging of type 1 diabetes has been absolutely the accelerant to move clinical trials forward, because you're talking about different endpoints, whether you're talking about preventing clinical diagnosis or delaying progression after diagnosis. And those are completely, sometimes different biological questions, completely different mechanisms you want to target, and different risk-benefit ratios when you go to the regulators.
I think we have time for one more question.
Really wonderful talk. Thank you so much for coming. I'm curious about the relationship between VCs or mission-led funding sources for advocacy groups. How do y'all get the funding to go and advocate for people, and how does that change depending on the types of trials that you kind of created and the history that your organization has?
So as we're a nonprofit, so we get donations, which is primarily major gifts. We have $150 million through a partnership with Gates Ventures, and that is focused solely on biomarkers because nobody was investing in biomarkers. And then and as I said, we are also a public foundation, and